Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to BookTrek 2021. This is a 5-month mission I'm on with a bunch of other booktubers where we're talking about Star Trek fiction, one iteration at a time. So we spent August talking about the original series, Kirk, Spock, McCoy, and we're spending September talking about reading Star Trek The Next Generation, which for a lot of you is the Star Trek. For a whole generation of people, Star Trek The Next Generation was their Star Trek. They grew up with it. They watched it develop. They had what I have to admit is a pretty effective parental role model in Jean-Luc Picard, the captain of the Enterprise D, and remained partisan towards it even while I was railing from the sidelines saying, this is really boring. This is a really boring version of Star Trek. I got some of those original impressions early. The ship seems much more like a floating city than like the Starship Enterprise. It's got a flat bottom. It's enormous. It's got 1,000 people on it. It's got families on it. Many members of whom, I presume, have no duties on board the starship. They live there because their loved one of their member of their family has a job on the ship. So they're not back at port. They're on the ship. The children have school there. They grow up there, I guess, have premarital sex there. The families have family counseling, or the spouses, the husbands or the wives, have to come up with something to do. I don't know how any of that works, and it was details like that bugged me. It seemed so much bigger, so much more advanced as to be impersonal when I saw it as a continuation of the original Star Trek. It was only later, and it's been through watching some of the movies. I've been rewatching some of the movies. I've been rewatching a lot of the series, the individual episodes, and I've been talking to a lot of Star Trek The Next Generation fans. It's only through doing all of that I have started to realize that looking at The Next Generation as an inheritor of the original show is probably the first mistake. It's its own thing. It takes place almost 100 years after the time of Kirk and Spock and McCoy. So I pointed out in the last video that I haven't made many of these Star Trek The Next Generation videos, but I intend to. I tend to make up for lost time. I pointed out that it doesn't seem like almost 100 years have passed. The ship is much bigger, yes, but it's basically the same thing. The Starfleet, the protocols of Starfleet, the Federation, its borders, its enemies, its protocols, its technology, all of it seems very, very similar. It seems like it exists basically 30 years after the original series instead of 100 years after the original series. You have to keep in mind, right? Picture the USS Enterprise in the year 2000 versus the USS Enterprise in the year 1900. That's the difference that we're talking about here, only without Moore's law being taken into effect, which is that the difference would be much greater. The technology would improve much, much more. I realize you're looking at it through the lens of what people thought in the 1990s or whatever Star Trek The Next Generation came out. They were envisioning a future and they just weren't envisioning enough. That's all. That's okay, and science fiction does that all the time. But part of the goals of mine for BookTrek 2021 for September is to come to a better understanding of The Next Generation, to like it more. I've got a great deal of comedic mileage over the decades out of making fun of it as the boring Star Trek, the boardroom Star Trek, the captain's ready room Star Trek. But I would rather love every iteration of Star Trek than get any mileage, comic or outrage, out of not liking an iteration of Star Trek. Fortunately, the iteration of Star Trek that I genuinely hate doesn't happen until BookTrek 2022. I don't hate The Next Generation. I've just never loved it, and I would like to. I would like to love it. I watched Star Trek Insurrection, the movie Star Trek Insurrection, where the villains are Anthony Zerbe and F. Murray Abraham. And I saw in that movie a crew that I could love. A crew that isn't the same as Jim Kirk's crew. Bridge crew, I mean. The core cast of characters. I saw a core cast of characters there that I could really like. There's one moment in particular, there are a lot of great moments in that movie. And a lot of them reflected back on the show. I suddenly realized when I was watching that movie, I was listening to, for instance, the dialogue that they give to Geordi LaForge, the chief engineer on board the Enterprise D. The dialogue that they give him is very much tailored to LeVar Burton. It's a no-nonsense guy who's very kind. it is a Starship Enterprise chief engineer who is not Montgomery Scott, who's not any kind of Montgomery Scott. Instead, he's a very different person. No nonsense, very straightforward, very kind, and very, very competent. I was watching that Geordi in that movie, and I was thinking back to the show and thinking, well, you know, that's not them retrofitting. He was written that way in all the episodes of The Next Generation. And maybe I just wasn't paying attention because he isn't Scotty. But the moment for me, there were a lot of great character moments in that movie. I think the character moments were better in Insurrection than any of the other things in Insurrection. The moment for me, there's a wonderful, funny bit where Riker and Deanna Troi are rekindling their romantic relationship, and he kisses her for the first time that he's had a beard, and she says, yuck, and ushers him out of her quarters. He's laughing his head off. He's standing at the door saying, I kiss you, and you say, yuck? That was really good, and that prompts him to decide to shave his beard off to please Deanna Troi. And there's a scene where the crew is walking through the corridors of the Enterprise. They've got business on their mind. They are thinking about business. They're thinking about the complications of the plot in the movie. But Data, the android on board the Enterprise, notices that Riker is clean-shaven. He doesn't say anything. He just notices the difference. And Riker sees him noticing. It does this and says, smooth as an android's bottom. And a minute later, when they're all breaking up to go on their separate missions, Data says, Commander, if I may. He feels Riker's face and goes, mm-mm. Because Data, presumably for some reason, knows how smooth an android's bottom is. That was a wonderful moment, and that was not the humor of the original show. The original cast did have lots of interpersonal humor, but it wasn't like that. It wasn't. Roddenberry originally had a vision of this crew as being a band of brothers, that his core bridge crew really liked each other. There wasn't any of the friction involved in, like, Kirk and McCoy and Spock. There wasn't anything like that. Instead, they were one team against everything else. And I don't know how much The Next Generation really adhered to that over the years. I'm not enough of an expert on the episodes, and keep in mind, I am not here signaling for all of The Next Generation lawyers to come forward and tell me. I'm asking that question because I will figure it out on my own. I don't know how much The Next Generation, in the episode-by-episode, season-by-season writing, really hewed to that idea of a band of brothers. But that idea is very much the background of Star Trek Insurrection, and it works perfectly. You'd think it would be boring that these 7 or 8 people are perfectly in sync with each other, perfect friends. But it isn't. It isn't boring at all. The only reason why I don't think if it happens in the Next Generation TV show, I think the only reason why I didn't see it is because Jean-Luc Picard seems so wintry and unlikable. In that show, he reminds me so often of bad bookstore managers that I've had. And I need to get around that. I need to get around that. And the first step will be not seeing The Next Generation as simply a follow-up to the original show. That's not fair to the original show or to The Next Generation. And I'm reading the novels. I haven't been making videos, but I have been reading the novels. And I'm noticing that the ones that I'm really liking are the ones where the author starts from that place. That this is a crew that I don't mean to keep bringing up Star Trek Insurrection. I just watched it, so it's on my mind. But I've seen it also in great shows, in great episodes. The feeling is that this bridge crew is kind of almost smirking at an inside joke because they know they're all in it together and that they'll take anything that the galaxy throws at them. And I've noticed that the novels, the Next Generation novels that I'm reading that manage to do that, are the ones that are far more enjoyable than the ones that don't. Far too often, the writers of Next Generation novels seem to think what they need to do is split the cast up. When if that's the gestalt of your bridge crew, that's the last thing you want to do. Far too often, I've read probably 10 Next Generation novels, and so far for BookTrek 2021, and far too often, the premise is stated in Chapter 1, and then Data and Deanna Troi go off on the adventure, and that's the whole novel. Or the popular team-up is Worf and Riker go off on an adventure, and then you get back to the ship shows up to save the day at the end. That has not worked for me. And unfortunately, the novel that I'm talking about today is by W.R. Thompson. It's called Infiltrator. And it's unfortunately not a good novel. not a good Next Generation novel. Partially for that reason, although the crew does largely stay together here. Partly the main reason why this doesn't work for me is because it forgets what I am trying to remember, which is that the Next Generation is not just the original series 2.0. In this case, with a concept that we've encountered before in BookTrek, which is what Star Trek Enterprise refers to as augments. Genetically engineered supermen. Genetically engineered humans. We saw The Rise and Fall of Khan Noonien Singh, a 2-volume original series novel by Greg Cox about Khan Noonien Singh, who is a genetically engineered Superman who is awakened with his crew in the original series episode Space Seed. The Enterprise overtakes the USS Botany Bay with its whole crew in suspended animation. They wake them up. It turns out the whole crew are genetically engineered super people from the eugenics wars of the 21st century of Earth. And that episode is kind of weird, as I've mentioned a few times. The augments on Star Trek Enterprise are augments. They are physically superior. No one has a chance against them. The augments in Space Seed aren't really all that. They don't seem really all that superior. And as incomprehensible as that is, the ending of the episode is even more incomprehensible. Khan and his crew try to kill Captain Kirk. They try to take over the Enterprise. And when they are thwarted, Kirk decides to strand them on Ceti Alpha 5. He decides to strand them on an Earth-like planet with no technology. Which is bizarre. That is just a bizarre ending. You would hold them in the brig until you go to the nearest starbase, and you would turn them over to the Federation. They're guilty of a crime. A series of crimes. They're not guilty of the crime of being genetically engineered in the 21st century. They're guilty of trying to kill Captain Kirk and take over the Enterprise. That's a crime under Federation law. They're obviously criminals. So you don't strand them on a planet where the next passing freighter can let them loose on the galaxy. Instead, you incarcerate them. And that doesn't happen in Space Seed, which is really kind of weird. And it was too good an idea for later writers to leave alone. And this writer takes it up. It turns out there's a planet called Hera, whose inhabitants are continuing to experiment with human genetic engineering. And they pose a threat. They want to take over the Enterprise and take over the galaxy, exactly like Khan would want to do. No idea from the chronology of Star Trek whether or not what these characters know about Khan. How widely known is Khan's final fate to the Federation 70 years after it happened? The Enterprise crew, the focal point here, the narrative focal point is Lieutenant Worf, the head of security for the ship. And the Enterprise crew has a woman on board who is, unbeknownst to them, a genetic superwoman. A renegade genetic superwoman. She's not part of the genetic people on the plan on the planet Hera. And the Enterprise, once they find out that plan, they want to enlist her to help them to thwart these genetic super people. And I guess there's a plot there, but it entirely exists to be a second chapter to Space Seed, and it shouldn't. It shouldn't. Writers, I always talk about a series notebook, a Bible that writers for the original series books had to follow. You can't kill off an established continuity character. It has to happen in canon. In other words, on screen. You can't do that otherwise. You can't turn a sane character insane. You can't make an established character who is not a villain into a villain just to serve your dramatic purposes, that sort of thing. I don't know what the Bible is like for the Next Generation novels. I'm pretty sure the Next Generation novels are not written anymore. But if there were one, I would like to hope that the biggest thing in it would be you will not just write part 2 of original shows. That didn't work when the Next Generation did it on screen, and it doesn't work in books either. Why would the Federation still be worried about this kind of thing? Why? And how could a genetic superwoman be on Enterprise, the flagship of the Federation? How could she be on the Enterprise D without anyone knowing it? Worf mentions at one point in this book that he saw her handling a piece of equipment that would have been a real struggle for him to lift. And she seemed to be having no trouble. At one point in this book, she arm wrestles with another crew member, and the crew member is non-human. It's a big arthropoid creature with superhuman strength. And she not only beats this person in arm wrestling, but breaks his arm. Without trying, without any noticeable effort at all. this doesn't come to Worf's attention. He doesn't think, well, considering how many things have gone wrong with human genetically engineered augments in the past, maybe this person, who obviously has super strength, is a genetically engineered superhuman, and maybe therefore there's a problem connected with it. And also, how did this woman get on board the Enterprise? Didn't she have to beam over? If she had to beam over, that means they have to have her transporter pattern. The transporter pattern won't tell you if the person you're beaming over has been genetically engineered to the gills. Didn't this person have to go through a routine physical? Didn't Beverly Crusher have to examine her? Wouldn't Beverly Crusher immediately notice that she can lift 600 pounds? These are the sorts of questions that you get if you don't just break new ground. And I kind of want that. I want two things. I know already now, I'm going to be reading The Next Generation all month long. But I know already I want that gestalt of all of these people together. I know I want that. I won't always get it because that's not practical for a novel. I understand the limitations here. You give somebody a 60,000 word limit and tell them you've got 3 weeks. There's only so much you can do. You might want to concentrate on a couple of characters there rather than try to give everybody something to do. I want that, though. And I also want this to stop. I want these kinds of holdovers from the first series to stop. I know they're fan service. I know they're candy to fans like me. In the Next Generation series, when it was on TV, you could never more certainly guarantee that I would watch the first run of an episode than if TV Guide or Starlog Magazine or Entertainment Monthly had said that it was going to have a callback to the original show, that Spock was going to appear, that Scotty was going to appear. You could be certain that I would be watching that episode. And those episodes often had huge swellings in the ratings for viewership. I know it's tempting, but I don't want to see it. I want to see this world, not that world. That was my mistake in estimating this stuff. So our Star Trek The Next Generation book for today is a failure. I can't recommend this in any way. It's kind of dumb. It has huge plot holes all the way to the very end. Oh my God, the big reveal at the end in like the last 30 pages is not only unexpected, it's stupid. Just plain stupid. And the characters aren't really in character. Worf is more of a doofus than anything else here. I can't recommend this book, and I think part of the reason is because it's paying fan service to an earlier concept instead of breaking new ground on its own. So I will try for something different. Tomorrow we will be back on the track of BookTrek, and I will see you then. Thank you, BookTube.